In this lesson, we're going to cover visual aids. Reason we're covering it this week is because when you deliver your persuasive speech, you will have to deliver it with a PowerPoint slide. So how many different kinds of visual aids are there? There's multiple kinds. You could bring in models, photographs, drawings. Graphs and charts can be put into your PowerPoints. Videos can be downloaded and put into PowerPoints. You yourself could be a visual aid. I had a student once do a visual aid for how to be a dancer, and he taught the class different dance moves. And as I've stated, the PowerPoint, which is what you'll be required to do for this next speech. Guidelines for preparing your visual aids. Especially with the PowerPoint, prepare well in advance. I stress that this should be prepared days in advance so that one, you can practice with it and it will flow smoothly as you practice. And two, you want to make sure that you can send it in plenty of time. Sometimes when students send in their PowerPoints, my computer won't take it. It will say there's a possible virus attached. So I will email you back and say, please resend, or the formatting was done incorrectly, or it became corrupt. Any number of things can go wrong when you use technology. So you want to make sure that you not only prepare it in plenty of time, but you also send it prior to the deadline. So that way, if there are any issues, we can get them resolved before the class. You want to keep your visual aids very simple and clean. There are some videos attached to this lesson that I've searched on YouTube for you that will give you some clear guidelines on how to achieve a good PowerPoint presentation. Make sure that when you use text or pictures that they are large enough to see. I believe 36 point is the smallest font that you should use for a PowerPoint. You want to make sure that it's going to be large enough for the audience members in the very back of the classroom to see. And you want to make sure too that when you as the presenter are using it, you turn around and you want to make sure that you can read it as well. I've had students before that when they typed up their PowerPoint used 12-point font, and that's acceptable for papers, but way too small for PowerPoints. You do want to use limited amount of text. Too much text on a slide can be overwhelming for audience members. It's also bad for you, the speaker, because then you tend to read your PowerPoint slide, which is a big no when you are presenting a PowerPoint slide. You do not want to read your information. Use fonts effectively. This means making sure that the font is easy to read. So stay away from script and any other font that's curvy and pretty. You want to make sure that when you are using text that it is easy to read. Use color effectively. You don't have to use full-on white background with black bullet points. If you want to get a bit creative, you can. However, make sure that you're not using a purple background with dark blue font. Okay, so don't use dark on dark or light on light. Make sure that whenever you do use color, that you use it to where it's still easy to read and easy to see. When you're using images, make sure that you're making them large enough to see. I see this at least once every term that a student finds a chart that he or she wants to use in their PowerPoint slide. And after they download it from the internet and they add it to their slide, come to find out it's too small. So what do? You stretch it. And what students tend to do is they stretch it too far. The image becomes pixelated. I've had a student before go ahead and send in his slide like that, And then when it came time to present, he did not try to memorize the information. He thought he could just read it off of the charts. But after it's been projected onto the screen, you could barely tell it was even a chart. He had no idea about the information. He tried to play it through. And then when he kept stumbling, he just stopped and said, "I don't know why this chart is here." Okay, make sure that if you're going to use a chart, that when you stretch it, you can still see it. It's not pixelated. Or two, you may have to take 30 minutes and just redesign the chart. Now, guidelines for presenting your visual aids. Display your visual aids where listeners can see them. So if you're going to bring something else, like a model of the aircraft that you work on, or anything that's going to be a 3D visual aid, display where everyone in the audience can see it. Avoid passing visual aids. Always, never ever pass a visual aid, because what happens? You say in your speech, "Here's my visual aid and I'm going to pass it around for everyone to be able to see it." Instantly, half your audience members aren't going to listen to you anymore, because they are going to be so focused on that visual aid coming through. Now, you've absolutely guaranteed that as soon as you hand that visual aid over to the first audience member, they're not listening to you. Neither is the person that's waiting to see that visual aid next, because they're going to make sure that they are paying enough attention to the audience member sitting next to them, so that way they can take the visual aid. Now that the first member has passed that visual aid to the second member, the first member is completely lost in what you're saying, because he or she has not been listening to you for the last 2 minutes anyway. Audience member 2 is still not paying attention to you, because they're too busy being distracted with the visual aid. And now audience member 3 is doing what audience member 2 was doing, which is not paying attention to you in anticipation for the visual aid. So you've absolutely guaranteed that you will knock out 3 listeners throughout your entire speech, because you're passing around a visual aid. So never ever pass around a visual aid. Display your visual aids only when you are speaking about them, otherwise they can be a distraction. Explain clearly why your visual aid is important to your presentation. That means that each of your PowerPoint slides should also have value to it. Make sure that you're talking to your audience and not your visual aid. I see so many students do this, that when you present a PowerPoint, you continually read the bullet points off of the presentation. Don't do that. You are supposed to be practicing with your visual aids. You're still supposed to memorize your speech. This is not a crutch for you to just not practice this week. And the last tip is reserved for when you become a presenter and you present outside of the classroom. You do not have to worry about checking the room and equipment for the class. I've spoken about this book before, and these are some tips that I pulled from the book that I thought were important that you be aware of as well. So think about what's in control of what. Are the visuals controlling the speaker, or is it the other way around? So if after each time you click for the slide to go to the next slide, are you having to look at the slide? Are you having to read the slide and then turn around and talk to your audience? If so, there's no point in you being the speaker. Okay? Make sure that your visual aid is not your crutch. Don't let your visual aid steal your spotlight. you are still supposed to be bringing important information to that presentation. If you're reading the slides, then the slides are in control of you. There's no reason for you to be there. So make sure that you add the value to you and not place all the value on your slides. Ineffective speakers will read the slides. This also causes you to break the eye contact, the connection, and the trust with your audience members. What you want to do is to use the slides to amplify the content. I had a student once who was doing a persuasive speech on why we should take pit bulls off of the banned dog list or the dangerous dog list. And she had all these pictures of the cute little pit bulls and went over the history as to how they got onto the list and why they should be removed. She never had to look at those slides because she didn't have information on the slides. The slides were there as the emotional appeal. The big, sad puppy dog eyes. The sad pit bull behind the shelter cage. They were there and they enhanced the emotional connection. There weren't any words for her to read because she already memorized her whole speech. It was perfect. So make sure that you are using those slides to amplify your content, to bring home an emotional connection to your audience members. Also, make sure that you're not using language that draws attention to the fact that you're using slides. I can't tell you how many presentations I have seen where people will use language such as, and you'll see here on this next slide, and let me click and show you the next slide. Don't bring attention to it. Believe me, your audience members are going to notice when your slides change. So instead of saying, this next slide shows our strategy for, you can change your language to say, our strategy for next year is to blank. Winning strategies for power presentations. This covers a lot of information too on PowerPoints. Again, Amazon Prime members should be able to rent the book for free if you'd like to study more on the subject after the course is wrapped up. Pulled some information from this book that I wanted to bring to your attention, which is of course to keep your slides simple and to tell your own story. Use the 5-second rule for your slides if you have any questions about if there's too much information on them. And the way that you use the 5-second rule, you put the slide on the screen, remove it after 5 seconds, and then ask a viewer, a spouse, a friend, a colleague, someone to describe what was on the slide. If there's too much on the slide, they'll get confused on what was on it. A simple slide will make the point much more clear. Don't put slide numbers on your slide presentations, and also make sure that you don't tell your audience how many slides there are. I sat through a briefing once, and the briefer in front of me had a long PowerPoint presentation. And he stood up and he had the numbers of the slides on the bottom. He would also announce, my first slide of 110 shows, and everyone in the audience, you could hear and you could feel the groans. 110 slides. Never tell your audience members how many slides you have. And also don't announce which slide you're on. I promise you, half that audience checked out. They weren't listening to anything he said after he said he had over 100 slides to show them. That's going to cover our lesson on PowerPoint slides. We'll also cover too in the assignment section below the requirements for those PowerPoint slides.